All right, hello, my Old Testament students. I'm going to make a short video here for you all. First thing, I put up a discussion board to kind of finish the Torah part. And it's just a general discussion. I want everybody to contribute something because, you know, the discussion boards will end up being 10% of the grade. Now that we're going to get into Joshua and Judges and the actual history of Israel as a nation, there's going to be a few more discussion boards as we go along, but I didn't want to do everything. I didn't want to do a whole bunch with the Torah because, you know, a discussion board on Leviticus, that would be fun. Instead, I have one question to finish the Torah, and it's kind of an open-ended question. Given everything that we've covered from Genesis to Deuteronomy, which is basically Genesis 1 through 11, the creation early prologue account, the patriarchs in Genesis, the story of the Exodus, as well as the Torah laws, the Levitical laws, all that stuff. Given all that, I'd like for you all to give a comment, you know, not just a sentence, but, you know, don't write an essay or anything, but maybe a good paragraph or short paragraph of what have we covered thus far that you have found most interesting, that you had not known before, the most eye-opening passage, what have you. Share something that you want to contribute, and then I want everybody to at least do that, and then I would encourage you, because it is a discussion board, that as you read what other students have written, you know, if you want to comment, you know, have a little discussion among the class about certain things that you learned about the Torah. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, the next assignment that you're going to be doing, we're about to get into the more, you know, starting with Joshua's conquest and all the historical stuff. I've opened up the next two assignments. The first one is going to be, I think, on chapter 9. It's an overview of Old Testament history. And this is, sorry, itchy there. It's just a big overview. It's a lot of historical background. And to help you, and I told you that I would do this at the beginning, I've provided in the module a file called Old Testament Timeline. And it's a handwritten timeline that I have made. It's the best I can do because I don't know how to do this on a, you know, computer. I had to write it by hand. This will help you. This is when I do the course in person, in class, I cover this timeline over and over again. Because if you want to understand the Old Testament history, you just have to get familiar with this timeline. And if you print it off and you look at it, that's a lot of stuff. It's daunting at the beginning. That's why in the person course, when I do the course in person, I do it little by little, but I'm just giving it to you all at once. I'm going to take you through it little by little. I'll be referring to it a lot throughout the rest of the course, especially this next section. But I just wanted to walk you through it right now to give you a big, general, broad overview of when we're talking about Old Testament history, this is what we're talking about. Now, so print it off, have it, be looking at it as I talk about this. The way the Old Testament history is laid out, you have, and you look at the very left edge, Genesis 1 through 11 is called the primeval history. It kind of sets the stage for understanding history. Then you have Genesis 12 through 50, that's the patriarch stuff. Then Exodus through Deuteronomy, roughly between 1800, 1440-ish. That's Exodus through Deuteronomy. What we're going to be about starting is the Joshua stuff, okay? Now, historically speaking, the setting of Joshua is anywhere between 1400 and 1200 BCE, okay? That's going to be that time, okay? And you'll be reading about that next time. I'll talk about that in my next video. Then there's the time of the judges, the settlement of the land. That would be takes you up until roughly 1050. Once you get there, you get to 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. And those 4 books really take you through the entire history of Israel, the United Kingdom, and then the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's what you see here. 1st and 2nd Samuel covers the time, basically, it covers the prophet Samuel, his anointing of King Saul, and then eventually of King David. 1st and 2nd, and then that's 1st Samuel, and then 2nd Samuel covers the reign of David. It could just be called David, but it's called 2nd Samuel. And so all of that, 1st and 2nd Samuel, covers roughly 1050 to 930. Okay, because 930 BCE is when Solomon becomes king. And so as you can kind of see here, the reign of Saul is roughly 1050 to 1010. David is 1010 to 970. Then Solomon is 970 to 930. I misspoke earlier there. Okay, that's known as the United Monarchy. Okay, Solomon's reign is covered in 1 Kings 1 through 11. Okay, and so when we go through that, that'll be that time. All of this is set against the backdrop, and if you look at the top of the chart, I kind of give you the major world powers of the time. This entire history of Israel, from a world perspective, Israel is this small slab of land in the middle of a larger competing empires. When you read the Bible, you almost kind of think that this was like the major empire of the ancient world. It wasn't. It's a small kingdom that is dwarfed by the larger empires of Egypt on one hand, and then later on Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Those are the big players, and the whole story of Israel is of this little kingdom in the midst of all this. Okay? So as you can tell, Genesis to 1 Kings 11 are kind of one line. Below that I have, if you see the Ruth. Ruth is an interesting story. Ruth is actually considered part of the writings, but it's set during the time of the judges. So it's written later, but it's set during that time. All right, once you get to 1 Kings 12, when Solomon dies, you have his son Rehoboam take over, and the northern tribes send a guy named Jeroboam to request Rehoboam to take it easy on them because they were worked really hard by Solomon, and we'll get to this as when we get to it. Solomon didn't enslave the northern tribes, but he put a lot of them under forced labor, and they didn't appreciate it. And so they appeal to Rehoboam, the next king, to lay off. And Rehoboam basically says, no, I'm going to put the hammer down even more. I'm going to be a tough guy. And that leads to the split of the United Kingdom. And that's what you see in the chart, a split, where the northern kingdom was taken over by Jeroboam and random kings after that. And then the southern kingdom becomes known as Judah. Okay. Now, as you can tell, the northern kingdom existed from roughly 930 to 721. It lasted for about 200 years. Okay, and in that northern kingdom, a bunch of kings, but the two to note, the one major one to note, two major ones to note is Jeroboam. Three major ones to note: Jeroboam, the original guy. We'll talk about him. Then there's King Ahab. He's the famous King Ahab and Jezebel. They confront Elijah on Mount Carmel. The prophets of Baal story is going to be up there. That takes place in the northern kingdom. And then later on, there's Jeroboam the second, which we'll talk about later. But it's important to note that when we do get to the prophets, of all the prophets that are in the Old Testament, the two that specifically address the northern kingdom are Amos and Hosea. So when we do get to those guys, when we're reading Amos and Hosea, you have to realize that they are pre-exilic prophets who spoke to the northern kingdom. That's a whole situation to understand them, okay? That's the northern kingdom. And then the northern kingdom gets destroyed in 721 for reasons we will find out later. The bottom line of the southern kingdom of Judah obviously goes a lot longer. That's the main one we want to consider. That's the Davidic dynasty. The Davidic kings, the line of David, continually had a king all throughout the king of Judah, up until it was destroyed in 587. And as you can tell on the timeline, you had Rehoboam was the king, had a lot of other kings mentioned, as we'll find out when we go through everything. But some of the major dates you're going to want to be familiar with, and I'm going to say them very quickly, and I'll say them again in later videos. Before I do that, I'll just point out everything I can. You have underneath Rehoboam a little asterisk with Pharaoh Shishak plunders the temple. That was a historical event that happened early on in Rehoboam's reign. Shishak, Pharaoh of Egypt, kind of came into Judah and plundered the temple. and he took away a lot of Solomon's wealth. But he's mentioned, and he's a historical figure we know about. Okay, the time dates that you're going to want to be familiar with are these. Roughly 742, the mid-8th century, there was a thing called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis, and it is super important to know. But we'll get into that when we get into 2 Kings. But basically what had happened is the new king Ahaz of Judah came to power around that time. And at that time, the northern kingdom of Israel and another kingdom called Aram, both are known as Syria. Aram was also known as Syria. Israel is also known as Ephraim, so it's called the Syro-Ephraimite crisis. Basically, they teamed up and they threatened to invade Judah and to unseat Ahaz. And Ahaz, because he was afraid, appealed to the superpower of the time, Assyria, to come in and help him. And basically what happened is Assyria came in, destroyed Aram, and then in 721 ended up destroying Israel. But then Assyria, like a mob boss, put its boot on the neck of Judah and kind of was oppressing Judah for the next 100 years or so. That is a really important thing to realize as we go through the history. But the Syro-Ephraimite crisis is really important. The next date you want to realize, in 701, there was a thing called Sennacherib's invasion. Basically, to think of it this way, is Ahaz asked Assyria to help, and Assyria helped, but then oppressed Judah. Ahaz's son, Hezekiah, rebelled against Assyria and successfully got Assyria to be pushed back a little bit. That's the Sennacherib's invasion. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came in to try to put down Hezekiah's rebellion, and he did do a lot of damage, but he never took Jerusalem, and eventually he backed off. Okay? After Hezekiah, there was Manasseh, who was Hezekiah's son, who was known as one of the worst kings of Judah. He repaganized everything. After that, and you can kind of see here a lot of dates during the reign of King Josiah. Josiah was the last great king of Judah. He came to the throne in 640. In 628, he started to do major reforms. And roughly around that time, that is when some priests who were renovating the temple found the book of the law, which we talked about earlier, was believed to be Deuteronomy in some form. And when he found the book of the law and read the blessings and curses, he said, we got to ramp up the Reformation even more. And this led to the Josiah Reformation. And eventually, it seemed to be going well with Judah. In 621, that's when they found the book of the law. In 612, Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, their foe, who was still in the area, Nineveh fell, so Assyria empire was crumbling, and there was much rejoicing in Judah. But then, tragically, in 609, Josiah got killed, and from that point on, within 20 years, Judah was destroyed. This is when Babylon came on the scene in 605, and Babylon became the new oppressor. Babylon first came to Judah in 597. This is the first deportation. When you read about stories of Ezekiel and Daniel going into exile, they went into exile in 597. But Judah existed for 10 more years. And then the king of Judah at that point rebelled again. Nebuchadnezzar came back in the second time, and in 587 destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took not all, but much of the ruling class of Judah into exile. And in 587 begins the Babylonian exile. Okay? And then they were there in Babylonian exile until 539. Then Persia became the next empire. And when Persia defeated Babylon, the king of Persia, Cyrus, he decreed that the exiles could return to their homeland. And basically, from 539 up through 445, you see, this is going to be the accounts of Ezra and Nehemiah, and how they try to reform, but reassemble the exiles into a people again. Okay, so that's the timeline. Now, along with that, that's the general timeline of the Old Testament timeline. Along with that, at the very bottom of the chart, you see my various bullet points of the prophets. Again, when we do get to the prophets, you have to know where they fit in the historical timeline. So, for example, we talked about Amos and Hosea being the northern kingdom pre-exilic prophets. Then, if you look closely, you have in the 742 area, way at the bottom, what I call Proto-Isaiah and Micah. We think, what the heck is Proto-Isaiah? And we'll get to it when we get to Isaiah, but basically, the book of Isaiah is, at the very least, has two parts to it. Chapters 1 through 39, scholars call Proto-Isaiah, because chapters 1 through 39 are clearly set in the 8th century, between the Syro-Ephraimite crisis and Sennacherib's invasion. Everything there fits there. Chapters 40 to 66 in Isaiah take place after the exile, which would put it after 539. So if you kind of see, after 539, near the bottom, I have Deutero-Isaiah. Isaiah comes in two parts. That's the two setting of the two parts. Okay. Then you get a whole bunch of other prophets: Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Nahum, Jeremiah, Obadiah. All those prophesied roughly around the reign of Josiah up until the end of the beginning of the Babylonian exile. And again, this is important to place the prophets in their right time period, because it'd be kind of like if I gave you the Gettysburg Address and you knew your American history well enough to, oh, Abraham Lincoln, Civil War, you could read the Gettysburg Address knowing the historical background so you know what he's talking about. But if you had no idea of the history, and for all you knew, Abraham Lincoln, John Smith, George Washington, they were all kind of the same time, you're not going to be able to read the Gettysburg Address with any kind of historical understanding. And so this is why understanding the Old Testament timeline is important. So you can understand the 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd King timeline, but also when we get to the prophets, we'll be able to read each prophet within their historical context so we can understand what they're saying. Okay? And so, for example, when you read Nahum, Nahum is basically a prophetic book. It's a short prophetic book about the fall of Nineveh. And you're like, oh, Nineveh, 6:12. This is about a prophecy shortly before the fall of Nineveh, prophesying that Nineveh was fall, the end of the Assyrian Empire, so to speak. That helps you understand what's going on in Nahum. Same thing with the other prophets. But anyway, the exilic prophet, the main one is Ezekiel. The first half of Ezekiel is set between 597 and 587. But then once Jerusalem falls, the second half of Ezekiel, is after that. Lamentations is traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah. Lamentations is lamenting the fall of Jerusalem in 587. After that, you have Haggai and Zachariah. Haggai and Zachariah are very interesting because they date their prophecies to specific dates that we can pinpoint in history. Roughly, Haggai and the first half of Zechariah are dated between 520 and 518, basically. They're all concentrated there. So you have to understand what's going on at that point to understand what they're prophesying. After that, you have Jonah is an interesting book because the historical Jonah was a pre-exilic northern prophet in the 8th century. Okay? But the book of Jonah is clearly, for reasons we'll get into later, when we get to it, was written after the exile by the returning exiles, which have been the southern kingdom. So that's an interesting thing to understand Jonah. The prophet Joel doesn't have any specific dating setting in it, but there's clues in Joel that indicate that it is a post-exilic work. Then you have all the Malachi, post-exilic work. After that, you have all the writings, whether it's Esther, Daniel. Daniel is set in the exile, but it's written after the exile. Everything else, Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, all those are works that were written in their final form after the exile, but they have an impact on how we see things. Anyway, chapter 9 is going to give a big historical overview that is, when you're just reading it page after page, it can be kind of daunting. But my handy-dandy chart, even though it's written in bad handwriting, it'll help you understand not only chapter 9, but also everything else we go through for the rest of the course. As we go through everything else in the course, all the historical stuff, all the prophet stuff, I'm going to be referring to this chart a lot, so have it handy. Every time we go to a new book, see where it fits on in the chart, and by the end of the semester, you'll have a good understanding of the historical timeline of the Old Testament, and then, obviously, the specifics of each particular book. All right, enjoy the work.